Bienvenidos de nuevo a Oportunidades en Grecia, el podcast en el que tratamos de acercar las oportunidades que, en el marco de la internacionalización, de la exportación, la inversión y la captación de financiación, el país presenta para la empresa española. Welcome again to Oportunidades en Grecia, the podcast where we try to get business opportunities regarding exports and investments in the country Greece closer to Spanish companies. Today, for the first time, we repeat guest. Ilias Lekkos is here with us. Hi, Ilias. What's going on?
Thank you very much for inviting me again to your podcast.
First time we do it, and we're very glad of doing so. Ilias Lekkos, Dr. Lekkos, is the group chief economist and general manager at Piraeus Bank, one of the largest banks in Greece. Ilias is also a member of the board of European Reliance Asset Management, the Council of Economic Advisors of the Hellenic Bank Association, and the Foundation of Economic and Industrial Research. With big expertise regarding debt and foreign exchange, but not only, he has worked also with other main players in the financial sector, such as Standard & Poor's, Halifax, Bank of Scotland, to mention a few. Now, I would like to talk with you, Ilias, about the Greek economy. It goes without saying. The least we could say is that the Greek economy is doing well. You know, you name it, growth, inflation, unemployment, or should we say employment, fiscal sustainability, credit ratings. But, you know, there is still the debt, the trade balance, the FDI. We'll discuss about all this during our conversation. But without any further ado, let me ask you a couple of questions. Let me ask our expert of the day a couple of questions to see if Ilias can show us some light. We had our last podcast already 3 years ago. At that time, you mentioned Greece was landing already into a sort of a virtuous cycle. Did that happen? What has changed since that date?
Yeah, thank you very much. And indeed, when I was here, 3 years ago, we were talking about the potential of the Greek economy. Now, I think it's a very, this podcast has a very good timing because now we can talk about what actually has happened. And a lot of positive things have happened in the Greek economy over the past 3 years. I mean, in 2022, GDP grew by above 5%. Of course, that was a result of the response getting out of COVID and reopening the Greek economy and the Greek tourism sector that suffered a lot during COVID. But, in 2023, we had 2% plus GDP growth. 2024, again, it was above 2%. And this year, we expect growth to be close to 2% as well. So a lot of, positive thing, all this potential that we saw back in 2022 has actually materialized. Also, on the positive side, unemployment has declined substantially. Now, unemployment in Greece is below 8%, which may sound a lot to people sort of not being familiar with the Greek economy. But, you have to remember that back in 2016, unemployment was close to 25%. So, even if we go back to 2019, from 2019 up until now, more than 500,000 more Greeks have a job. So that was also a very, very positive development. And you also mentioned FDI in your introduction. Again, Greece has seen substantial inflows of FDI in the past few years. And we have also, I'm happy to say that we have seen FDI in sectors that we wouldn't normally expect. So Greece is attracting investors not only in the tourism sector and hotels and stuff like that, which is something that you usually associate with the Greek economy. we have received FDI in sectors like data centers, for instance, and a lot of the, huge international technology players have come to Greece to invest in data centers. And another sector that you usually wouldn't expect is shipyards. Greece has, Greece had a thriving shipyards and shipbuilding sector back in the 1950s. That wasn't able to cope with international competition and went bankrupt in the 70s and 80s. Now in Greece we have received a lot of FDIs, and these shipyards are back, and being fully operational. So these are just a few examples of how the structure of the Greek economy has changed over the past 3-4 years.
You mentioned, you started talking about GDP growth, and you mentioned that Greece has recorded above EU average growth in the last few years. All right. Do you think Greece has made it to its full potential? And if so, how has the evolution of the public accounts helped with that? What do you think about the investment gap? Those are a couple of things I would like to.
Yeah, these are all very interesting questions and very sort of very interesting topics. So, as I said, things have been positive for the Greek economy. But if you really ask me, I don't think that Greece has reached its full potential. You would expect, with all the money coming from the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which for Greece is a very big growth driver, also, taking into account the fact that we are starting from a very low base, investments to GDP back in 2016 were 11% versus a 21% European average. Now, from 11, we're back to 16, but still you can see that we're lagging behind the European average. So you would expect to see even faster growth. I think that in our previous podcast, I was forecasting 3% plus rather than 2% plus GDP growth. And that hasn't materialized. And I think that, if we really want to think why it hasn't materialized, I think that we really need to focus on certain bottlenecks in the Greek economy. I think the most important one has to do with the lack of labor force. I think that one of a very big difference between the Greek and the Spanish economy is that Spain has been very lucky and very fortunate to have this immigration wave from other Latin American countries. In Greece, we still lack labor force, so we see that labor-intensive sectors like agricultural production, tourism, and construction are not reaching their full potential because of lack of labor force. So that is a very big bottleneck. The second bottleneck, I think that it has to do with the very big success of renewables. Renewable energy in Greece, has been a runaway success, but we run into the bottleneck of electricity grid and storage. So in Greece, we have a very big issue with the high cost of electricity right now. Everybody's complaining. The households are complaining, and the industry is complaining. A very big part of this surge in prices has to do with, the invasion, the Russian invasion to Ukraine, and the reduction of the gas from Russia to basically a big part of Europe. But also we have not been able to exploit the capacity for renewable in its full potential. And the reason for that, as I said, is grid, which is designed in the 50s for a different way of producing electricity, and also lack of storage.
That makes sense. I mean, those are bottlenecks to get the investment to the position where it should be. Is then therefore credit flowing from the financial sector to the, let's say, the real sector, now that the NPL problem seems to be gone?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that, back, 3-4 years ago, NPLs in Greece was a substantial part of the bank's portfolio. Now, through a wave of sales, securitizations, and various other sort of mechanisms, the NPL ratio of the, for systemic banks is close to 3.5%. So NPLs now is not a problem. And also, liquidity is not a problem because, Greek banks have a loan to deposit close to 6%. So there is ample sort of liquidity to finance the private sector. So if you look at credit data, credit growth right now runs at 17% year on year. And almost entirely, this goes to the corporate sector. So there is very little demand, for instance, for mortgages or for consumer loans. In fact, mid-2025 is the first time that we saw positive flows on the mortgage portfolio. Up until now, the repayments of old mortgages, it ran above the new disbursements. So there was a negative net flow. Households were repaying mortgage debt. But on the corporate side, there is substantial credit flows going to financing new investments in Greece right now.
So, therefore, without those bottlenecks, the increase of the credit, the ratio at which the credit are increasing would go beyond that 17% that you just mentioned. That could happen eventually.
I think yes. I mean, it's only a matter of time. I mean, we have people who try to understand the Greek economy, and this is a wider issue, it's not directly your question, but people who listen to this podcast and they try to understand the Greek economy, they have to see Greece through a lens of the fact that, no investment had materialized in Greece for a very long time. So there is a substantial, and I think you mentioned that, a substantial investment gap in Greece. And that shows up in any sector. We mentioned the grid, we mentioned, there is no credit expansion, but real estate prices, residential real estate prices in Greece, they increase by 7 to 10% year on year. And that is a result of no investment and no new construction having taken place in Greece for the past 10 years. So this is, in a lot of areas, Greece is on a very different stage of the business cycle versus everybody else in Europe. And that has to do with the fact that we start from a very low base and we really need to increase at a very fast pace.
That makes sense. Absolutely. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned briefly before changes in landing in that virtuous circle and changes in the structure of the Greek economy, moving from the traditional tourism or shipping to something different. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? And also, could you tell us the historical evolution of FDI? Because there have been some ups and downs in the last few years. I think this last year was a year with big FDI. I think this year, the numbers seem to be very good as well, even better than last year. I don't know if I'm wrong. You could correct me. But how do you see the changes in the structure of the Greek economy and changes in the structure of FDI? You mentioned already that people came here to invest in data centers and sectors that 10, 15 years ago were unthinkable.
True. I mean, if you really want to see tangible evidence of how the structure of the Greek economy has changed, all you need to look is, A, the contribution of exports to GDP, and second, the composition of these exports. Back, pre-Greek crisis, back in 2000, Greek exports, both goods and services, were about 20% of GDP, and that has been fairly constant for decades. For decades, exports were 20% of Greek GDP, and that was mostly driven by services. That was tourism and shipping. If you look at the latest data, for instance, 2024, where we have full year data, you can see that exports now are 42% of Greek GDP versus 51% in the euro area on average. So from 20, we went to 42%, and we are very close now to European average. Even more interesting is when you see the composition of these exports. As I said, back in 20, 30 years ago, it was just tourism, shipping, and a few agricultural products. If you see the composition of Greek exports now, 50% of Greek exports are manufacturing goods. So it is industrial production. So exports now are close to 100 billion euros in Greece, and 50% of that is manufacturing products. So this is a very good indicator to look at how the Greek economy has changed.
Has the RRF played an important role in the Greek growth in the last few years, in the change in the structure of that growth? And what could we expect to happen once the funding is over by summer next year?
Absolutely right. I think that the RRF was a major game changer for the Greek economy. And it helped the Greek economy a lot, to basically leave behind both the Greek crisis but also the COVID crisis as well. And it was important for two reasons. First, because of its size, it was 20% of Greek GDP. So we're talking about a wall of money coming to Greece. But also it was very useful, the fact that it was directed to sectors that Greece needed investment. It was directed, for instance, towards the digitalization of the Greek public sector and the Greek economy in general. And let me tell you that, the digitalization of the Greek public sector and the way that Greek citizens interact with the public sector has been a runaway success. In many areas, I think that, Greece is way more advanced versus everybody else in Europe. And that has made a tangible change.
Yeah, definitely state of the art. When it comes to digital, state of the art in many fields.
Yeah, so digitalization was one of the areas that was financed by the RRF money, but also, again, renewables, the cyclical economy, training, all these were areas that benefited from RRF money. So you are right to worry about what's going to happen now that the RRF is sort of, coming to its end. So to that respect, it's very useful to keep in mind that the loan part of the RRF will continue for 2 or 3 years. So the structure of the RRF was that it was, 16 billion worth of grants that need to be absorbed up until the end of 2026, but the other half of the package was in bank loans. The bank loans do not need to be dispersed up until next year. You must have contracts signed for projects. So a lot of disbursements will continue in 2027 and 2028. All you need is to sign a contract, for instance, for a large infrastructure project, and the disbursements will continue. So I think that will provide some cushion to the Greek economy. The next big thing, though, that we really need to keep on our mind is that, the negotiations for the next EU budget will take place over the next couple of years. And the amount of money that Greece will sort of take out of this budget, I think it's the next big thing for the Greek economy, because everything that will be decided between 2025 and end 2027 will basically define how much money Greece will get out of the EU budget over the course of the next 7 years. So everything that will be decided now will define how much money Greece is going to get from 2028 all the way to 2034. So that the negotiations for the next 7-year EU budget are very crucial for the Greek economy and the trajectory of the Greek economy in the medium term.
Okay, so we keep going. We saw some your analysis of the evolution of the principal macroeconomic aggregates, investment gap, very important also, openness, much better, RRF. There is continuity somehow. There might be more continuity if things are well dealt with in the future, in the frame of the European funding. Any lessons that you think? I go a little bit far behind. Any lessons that you think we should pull out of the Greek crisis? Anything Greece should avoid in the future to guarantee that growth, a healthy growth, is just ahead? And a few words, if you might, about structural reforms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the most obvious lesson that, I think that all Greeks have learned, it has to do with the need for fiscal discipline. Okay, we cannot sort of run large fiscal deficits when we are in the European Union. So that is the obvious lesson, and I think that everybody has learned that in Greece. And the proof of that is that despite the fact that we had many sort of elections, let's say from 2016 up until now, you haven't seen any pressure for any from any side to relax fiscal discipline. So that is an indication that, the need for fiscal discipline has been sort of deeply understood by the Greek economy. But that's not the only lesson that we really need to take from the Greek crisis if we want to remain successful in the European Union. I think the second big problem that Greece had was the lack of competitiveness. And I think that it's very important for Greece to maintain its competitiveness. The effort to basically do internal devaluation within a monetary union was a very long and very painful process for the Greek society all these years. So we really need to maintain our competitiveness. And the way to do that is to keep inflation low. We really need the Greek economy to maintain its competitiveness by creating a cost advantage, and we can generate this cost advantage by maintaining low inflation rates below the core European countries. So that's the second lesson, and the third has to do with making a successful management of EU funds. in the problematic years, we were sort of using EU funds to give subsidies to farmers, hire more public sector employees. So there was no productivity angle to how we spent EU funds. Now with the RRF, we've learned that it's very important to direct EU funds to the productive sectors of the Greek economy.
Good to hear. Maybe we can come back to a few things later, but before that, now with a broader view, what are the challenges Europe is facing from your point of view these days, and how do those affect to the case of Greece?
Yeah, I think that Europe has been caught in a very sort of in a much broader geopolitical conflict. We all see the conflict between US and China, and basically how both these countries try to solve their own domestic problems by exporting stuff and protecting their own economies. And what really amazes me about Europe is the lack of urgency. I think that, in Europe, we are used to, making slow progress simply because we had to build consensus. You had to build everybody, all economists on board, and then make a decision. And I think that, when things like today are moving very fast, Europe is having a problem. And especially when you talk to people in Brussels, you get, personally, I become worried because there is this lack of urgency. We really need that. We really feel that we have the time to build consensus, make decisions, and sort of look for a solution that will fit and make everybody happy. And I think that's, in the current environment, that's problematic.
Yeah, that makes us react a bit slowly, maybe, to the huge events that we're facing lately.
I think that we will see how the negotiations, as I said, with the EU budget are going to go, because there are a lot of countries that basically want to go towards a smaller budget. I don't think that Europe can progress with a smaller budget.
I want to ask you, last question. You mentioned when you talk about bottlenecks, you talk about lack of labor force, and you talk about energy, renewables, the grid, storage, and then you talked about competitiveness and inflation. Do you think the decisions are to be made by the public sector, by the private sector? Is it a question of public investment, regulation, private investment? How can you solve those three things?
Yeah,
differently, I suppose, but
exactly. I don't think that the role of the state is to basically set the rules and create the right conditions for the private sector to be free to operate, because in Greece it is true that in many sectors we still remain very protected by a number of old rules, regulations. And it is one of the complaints that I have against the institutions. During the 10-year-long period of probation, where Greece was under the supervision of the so-called institutions, the labor market was fully liberalized. Okay, so we have a very competitive labor market right now, but the services sector especially remained protected. And that is what creates a lot of, inflationary forces in Greece. And it's very hard now for the government to make these structural changes.
Okay, so a lot of things we discussed about, a lot of things very interesting. We tackled macro, we tackled investment gap, degree of openness of the Greek economy. There are some similarities with the Spanish economy, which has also increased the degree of openness in the last few years, few decades. RRF, European funding for the next few years, 28-35. fiscal sustainability, competitiveness, inflation, lack of urgency.
Lack of urgency.
In the European Union, generally speaking, and in the institutions. Ilias, thanks a lot for joining today once again.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Y nosotros nos vemos de nuevo pronto en Oportunidades en Grecia. Aún hay mucho por conocer. Tenemos que hablar de contract, moda, pharma. Hasta pronto.